We're going to roll into our keynote presentation today, and I see that Samara is here, so I'm just gonna roll into introducing her because I know we are all really, really excited about having her here and hearing from her a little bit. So Samara Almonte is a first-generation Chicana, raised primarily in the Pacific Northwest in the occupied Coast Salish territory. She has ancestral ties to Michoacan, Mexico. I'm probably not pronouncing that right. Sorry, Samara. And she holds a BA in urban planning and sustainability development with a specialization in environmental justice and education from Western. During her time at Western, Samara was active in many student organizations, including the Student and Staff Coalition that established the first environmental justice minor within the university in 2019. She is a Doris Duke Conservation Scholars Program alumni from the University of Michigan and a recipient of the Fulbright English Teaching Assistant Award for 2019 to 2020. Outside her professional life, she's the creator and host of the podcast Raíces Verdes, or Green Roots, which I highly recommend if you're into podcasts. I listened to a couple of them and they're fabulous. Which focuses on validating, archiving, and sharing the experiences of Black, Indigenous people of color in connection to the environment. And we will post the link to her podcast so you guys can check it out at a later time. And with that, we would love to welcome Samara and have her present to us.
Hi everyone, good morning. I'm really excited to be here. And yeah, I'm just really excited that Stephanie really brought up this opportunity. I have been in the education field for a little bit now, so it's really exciting to be able to present to teachers today. Just to keep the ball rolling, I will start sharing my screen for the presentation. Let me mute my phone. All right, so the title's kind of lengthy, but it will make sense, I think, a lot as we go through the presentation about what I mean about institutionalizing environmental justice in the education system. So before we get started, just some guidelines that I kind of like to frame my presentations with. One, I'm only speaking on my experiences. I represent myself, not every person of color, not every woman of color, not every Mexican American, Chicana. And so I just want to put that out there because as you maybe read some more work by other women of color, other folks of color, that you don't just assume that we're all going to have the same politics, the same experiences. It's really based on, our individual experiences. And I think geography really influences that as well. Like I said, I was mostly raised in the Pacific Northwest, Duwamish territory, and so that's going to influence as well my experiences. And then with any of this anti-racist work, I think it's important to step into discomfort, but not let guilt consume you. I think a lot of times when we hear about these things, we can feel so guilty, especially as white folks. And that just really, I think, stops a lot of our growth because we can't think outside of what's already happening and not really take action if we're just feeling guilty and letting that be too heavy. And then anti-racist work is about a movement, not a moment. And so really, we're going to be here for a long time talking about these things, hopefully. And so just pace yourself and know that you're not going to learn everything today, but the fact that we're here talking about these things and encouraging each other to go further into this work, I think is already, important. And then I will be sharing my slides. There will be at times a lot of writing or some questions that you maybe want to write down to think about longer. So just, I would say if you want to just maybe listen instead of focusing on taking notes, then I think that might help you more, especially for a Q&A part at the end. I'm not sure who's monitoring the chat, but if people want to write questions in there, and then we'll maybe stack them up and get to them at the end of the presentation. So just some terminology, so I think we're all kind of on the same page. It might seem silly to put up the definition of racism, since we probably all know what racism is, but I do want to call attention to the fact that most recently it was added this second part to it about a political or social system founded in racism. And I think for a long time, especially in this country, we really thought racism was individual interactions, I'm racist to this person, I have these racist views of this person, but not really talking about it systematically, which is what we see in education, in the environmental movement, a whole system set up around racism. And so I think this is really important to today's conversation about environmental justice, is that it's part of a systemic form of racism. You can have individuals that are racist within environmental organizations, environmental education, but really like the system is set up to be racist. And then with that, environmental racism is like defined by the environmental justice movement, which is just structural racism that affects BIPOC in the environment they live, work, and play in. Again, I'm going to share all these slides so you have these definitions. A term that I'm going to be using that maybe is still new to you is BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color. It's just a way to talk about different communities of color. Most recently, there's been a movement to really distinguish between Black and Indigenous people because their lived experiences and histories across the globe are very unique and specific in the context of colonialism and like land and connections to the environment and just in general compared to a lot of other communities of color. So all I would say is when in doubt, be as specific as possible. If you're maybe talking about a specific student in your classroom or like a couple of students in your classroom and they all have the same identity, then just say that, like, you know, these Latinx student, these Indigenous student, these Black students, because again, their issues are probably going to be very specific. And there might be some similarities with other students of color, but again, I think the more specific, the better. And then environmental justice is a movement that was led by Black and Indigenous people since the 1960s, when it's kind of officially this movement started, but really I would say Indigenous people have been fighting for environmental justice since day one. And then it's just a lens to discuss structural intersections of like inequity with the environment in communities of color. Climate justice, similar to environmental justice, is just a way to talk about the intersections between climate change, social movements, and like thinking about the questions, who's most affected by climate change, who caused climate change. I think that's a really big one to ask, that it's not, you know, us individually, like it's, again, systematic capitalism, like all these big corporations that really led to where we are today. And then this is getting pretty popular, this term DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, just a way to talk about the different initiatives and anti-racist work that different organizations and education and people are doing. So Indigenous history, we could probably sit here all day and talk about like Indigenous people and their history. I really like the land acknowledgement and what was presented at the beginning when I came into this call. And so, you know, the map on the right is just one of the many maps that I think anyone in a physical classroom should have or should be showing to their students about whose land we're on, understanding the original names of the places we live and work and recreate. And for example, I was just up in the North Cascades this weekend, like camping, and I think it's super important that when I'm there, I understand like whose land that is and who was pushed out for me to be able to go to this national park, right? And so for this slide, I really wanted to more just pose questions that if you are having a hard time answering these, then maybe there needs to be an evaluation of how much Indigenous knowledge is part of your education or your curriculum. So, you know, like the basic one, like really knowing like whose land are you working on, living on? Do we know the Indigenous names of rivers, mountains, wildlife? I think a lot of times, you know, we'll use just like names like Mount Baker, like Mount Rainier, like those are not like their original names, right? And when we're bringing this up in education and curriculum, I think we just really got to start making that transition of what is the name of that mountain before it was like, you know, named by a colonizer. And then do you only bring up Indigenous people in the context of Thanksgiving or as a short unit in your curriculum? I think the Thanksgiving one, that could be a whole other presentation in itself. And I'm just really speaking from what I've learned from Indigenous people is that like the way we're teaching Thanksgiving is very much romanticized. And I think any student as young as like kindergarten can understand what actually happened in Thanksgiving. Like you can explain it with, you know, apples and oranges and be like, you know, these people just came and took this stuff. And then this is what's going on. So I think, again, just thinking about, are Indigenous people only part of your curriculum around that time? And that also goes with the last question. Are you communicating about Indigenous people in the past tense or in a circular notion of time, meaning that they're still present, they're still alive, they're still doing work, and they're gonna be in the future. And we're gonna have like Indigenous people have sovereignty in the future. Like, I think that's also really important because usually we talk about Indigenous people in the past, like they were here before, they did this, but like, again, Indigenous people are very much still alive and people are still resisting colonialism. So with that, thinking more about environmental organizations, I don't know how many of y'all maybe get the emails or texts or follow Sierra Club on social media, but they put out this really interesting post, like the images on the right are like screenshots of their Instagram post. where they basically called out John Muir and were just like, you know what, we understand actually now that this person was a white supremacist, he was like a eugenist, he was okay with, he like they have quotes of him, you know, removing indigenous, saying that he wanted to remove indigenous people to create national parks. And so what I want to bring attention to this is that with environmental justice, a lot of the things that BIPOC are calling for is for understanding that we got to this point of environmentalism because of white supremacy. Like there's a lot of your favorites are problematic. Let me just say that. John Muir, like Leopold, like all these other folks, right? And so we just have to be okay with that truth that every white man involved with the creation of national parks was comfortable removing those indigenous people to create these recreation areas. And like environmentalism really in this country is just white culture, it's part of white culture. Like BIPOC have definitely gotten involved and are part of it, but the way that we most mainstream understand environmentalism, it's definitely part of like white culture, because you'll talk to a lot of indigenous people and just general communities of color and ask them like, in your native language, like how do you say environmentalism? How do you say environmentalist? And most of the time they don't really have a word for it because their relationships to land and to water are different. And so they're described differently than like this word of environmentalism. So again, I think just thinking about who do you uplift in your education and your curriculum that you say like, oh, this is like a founding father of environmentalism or of the outdoors, but like really look into their history, you know, and think about like, yeah, the example that Sierra Club put out there, which personally, I think it took a long time for them to put out this message when people have been knowing for a long time that John Muir was problematic. So with that, thinking about how do you bring in more of an ethnic studies perspective into environmental education and just really any education. So before we get into specifically for environmentalism, and a quick intro to ethnic studies, if you're not aware of what it is, it was just really a time in the 60s when, again, because of Black people pushing forward the civil rights movement, other indigenous people, people of color really got radicalized and self-aware. And we're just like, yeah, you know what? We're also gonna ask for our rights in this country. We're also gonna build solidarity. And then in the college perspective, college students took that as a way to start demanding for a college of ethnic studies. So the first one was demanded in 1968 in San Francisco State University, where this quote is from. So they asked for establishment of 4 departments in American Indian Studies, Asian American Studies, Black Studies, La Raza Studies, which is basically like Latinx, Chicano Studies, within this bigger college of ethnic studies. And like this picture on the right, I think is super cheesy, but it's like, that's what was going on during that time. Like you had Black people, like different Asian communities, like Latinx, like, you know, Arab folks, like everyone coming together, like college students, and saying like, we are more than you all are here and you need us more than we need you. So we're gonna demand for this College of Ethnic Studies where we can actually learn about our history, learn about our people, and not just have it be like an elective class here and there. And just throughout history, since ethnic studies has been pushed, different people have called it anti-American, anti-white. I think in Washington, there was like recently a big move to like implement ethnic studies, like from pre-K to like K to 12 kind of thing. So there's a lot of different states throughout the last couple of years I've been trying to push for like an ethnic studies curriculum all throughout education. So I would definitely look into maybe seeing if you can support any of those local efforts when they are up, like, you know, in different ballots and such. And then a good film to watch a little bit more about ethnic studies would be Precious Knowledge. This one's focused on the movement in Arizona. And spoiler alert, it doesn't have like the best ending because again, folks are really about calling this out anti-American, anti-white, for people to have classes about their culture and knowledge. So I think it's just good to understand how political and important it is to understand the politics of the education system. So bringing it back to environmental like education, environmentalism, you can have this intersection of ethnic studies and environmentalism. And pretty much that, to me, that's really like my passion work, is like, how do we bring those two together and really understand that they're interconnected? So what I would say is like, you're going into the environmental education with an ethnic studies approach. And that means having more BIPOC environmentalists and scientists in your curriculum, you know, like the people that you talk about and the people that you bring up when you do maybe like different units and such. It also means bringing forms of knowledge outside of academia, which I know for a lot of us, it can be hard to step away from that since we went through an academic system, right, to get your teaching certificate. It's hard to maybe think outside of that. But I would say, for example, like looking into oral storytelling, you know, a lot of these Indigenous communities and just communities of color in general are oral communities where they recited a lot of their stories about land, about water in this way. Songs, poetry. I've been recently reading a lot more about how people attribute a lot of environmentalism to Harriet Tubman because the way she understood the stars, the land, the forest as she was taking folks to freedom. And so a lot of those songs, if you look at like the time of Black liberation, like they talk about land, they talk about water, about going through the water, going through the land, right, to freedom. Like those are connections to land and to like the environment. And so those are things that you can incorporate into your curriculum to talk about these connections. And of course, thinking about local context. So like, what are the Duwamish, the Chehalis people saying orally in songs, you know, in poetry about their environmental connections? Like, how can that be part of our everyday curriculum so that students, and it also helps probably like students' learning abilities, right? Like some folks just cannot focus or really process information of just reading out of a textbook or a presentation. Maybe orally and like songs and poetry is a way to understand those concepts. And then of course, I think every educator and everything we do should address colonialism as part of our greater environmental problems. So again, like when colonialism started happening, like those were disruptions to connections to land, to the environment, to water. And that really just set us up for really thinking about like disrupting those connections for BIPOC that now we're trying to rediscover and try to like, for Indigenous people, right, trying to ask for land back and that sovereignty. And so now thinking a little bit more outside of education and just some barriers for BIPOC in the outdoors. So these are just some that I thought of that I've just seen mostly and I've read a lot about. And again, there could be even more, but safety I think is a big one. Is there heavy police presence in some of these outdoor spaces? And police doesn't even have to mean just like a police officer, right? It could be like the park rangers too. Like that I think is some sort of form of authority that gives off like a police vibe. They can definitely act a little bit like that. And so just thinking about that, like why would, you know, a Black person or really any person of color want to be in an outdoor space if it's very heavily policed? Because for that, as we've seen now, it doesn't mean safety. So thinking about safety in different ways, right? And how hyper surveilled a lot of these outdoor spaces are. Finances, like what is the cost of recreating outdoors as we know it? Like it can be really expensive to get stuff together. Like I said, I just went camping this weekend and like I was really lucky that a lot of folks were like, oh, you know, you can borrow this, you can borrow that. And I only bought, I think, like a new tent and like a couple other things. So again, thinking about mutual aid even within the outdoor recreation world. Representation, again, like our BIPOC students, people seeing themselves reflected in the outdoor industry and programming. Most likely not in a lot of the ads, the magazines, the things that you look through that have to do with the outdoors. Like if you Google, you're not really going to see a lot of Black and brown people doing outdoor stuff. Accessibility, and this also of course intersects with disability justice, but just thinking about transportation, language accessibility at different outdoor spaces. Also like, again, if you're differently abled, like how can you move through the space to begin with? And then cultural context. So kind of how I was talking about, not every culture has an exact translation to environmentalism, environmentalists. Like really try to get to know your student, your community's context of like, what is their connection to the outdoors? Like, I think it can be really complex, you know, like if a student and their family is primarily farm workers, like maybe they don't feel comfortable going out the outdoors or recreating because they're like, well, that's where I do work already. Why would I want to spend more time outdoors when I'm already outdoors all the time working in the fields? So I think it's just important to think about the cultural context of the group you're talking about that you want to see more outdoors, and think about like, well, what are some maybe cultural things that are not making them feel safe or like wanted or be part of the outdoors in the way that I think about it. It could be that they do outdoors differently, you know, for them it could be more about socializing in the outdoors instead of just like hiking and doing these like physical things. So coming kind of to the conclusion about all these different aspects of academia that I've just shared with you all, I think this is the part about how can you make this into the institution? How can you really put it into the institution? And so I think subcommittees and task force are good in some ways, but it can only do so much because everyone needs to be involved in the part of taking action. And also, let's say it's only like 5 or 6 people that are really pushing forward this environmental justice framework. they're going to get burnt out. Like, that's a lot of work. Like, that's kind of what happened for me and some of my other student colleagues at the university when we're really pushing for this environmental justice minor at Western, was that eventually we were starting to get burned out because it felt like it was only the same 10 students who really wanted this environmental justice minor. So again, spread out the work. You know, here we already have like 40 people. Like, how can y'all spread out the work so no one gets burned out and this anti-racist movement can really continue? And then don't be afraid of changing your curriculum, programming, you know, with some of the things I brought up. But again, systemic change versus individual changes. Like, you as an educator probably can make some changes around curriculum and add things. But again, can we implement an ethnic studies systematically? Can we implement ethnic studies across the state? You know, like, really think about those systemic changes. And then again, ethnic studies versus a Eurocentric approach to education, I think will do a long way and really change some of those. And of course, with that, hire more BIPOC educators with an ethnic studies approach. So like that they have that ethnic studies background and can bring that context, the cultural context, to their education. So that was a lot of information, but I wanted to get through the presentation a little bit faster just so that we could now take time for you all to maybe share out ideas that you have now for your classroom, ask questions, and we can move through the presentation to look through some of those notes if you all want to.
So Samara, would you prefer that people type their questions in the chat, or we kind of have a large group, so I'm afraid if too many people unmute themselves at the same time, it might get confusing.
Yeah, I can.
I can help you with that. Like, I can read them to you if you want.
Yes, I think. Yeah, maybe just reading out loud from the group chat sounds good.
Okay, so if anybody has either questions about what Samara presented, or maybe some ideas that you're thinking about for, you know, implementing into your classroom this fall. You know, so much has changed over the summer that I'm sure that this is like forefront on a lot of your minds, or maybe some best practices that you have been doing for a really long time that help to engage those BIPOC students in your classes. Samara, I was, one thing that I keep thinking about when I think about, you know, that systemic change is the commitment that it's not, it's going to be a long-term commitment, you know, and this type of change doesn't happen overnight. So I would think there's going to be some patience and perseverance required in order to see real change.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even saw it just within my 4 years at Western. Like, when I was there as a freshman, someone had kind of like whispered, you know, like, oh yeah, someone tried pushing for an environmental justice minor, but they just, like, the students graduated. And so we took on that work. And again, it was another 4 years of like finally getting that environmental justice minor. And then it's going to take some more work to continue that work. So yeah, I agree. It can be a long process.
So we have a question from Ide asking, can you speak about what—
Stephanie, it doesn't make sense.
Okay, go for it. Yeah, you go for it.
Can I just ask? Okay. So Samara, thank you very much for being here this morning. I am a Mexican-American immigrant, first generation out of Southern California, and I now teach in Shelton School District, where there's a large, it's a bubble within Western Washington, I think. We have a large population of immigrants from Mexico and Guatemala, both indigenous of Mayan descent and of mixed, descent. So my question is, can you share what you have observed, people who are advocating for what you're speaking about? How is that different for a person who is BIPOC to advocate versus someone who is not? So let's just say a BIPOC person advocating for a change in the system to integrate maybe the ethnic studies aspect of it into the system versus a person who is white advocating for that. What have been your observations about what is different about who approaches and advocates for that change?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because I was also involved with pushing for an ethnic studies college at my university. So we definitely saw that where when students of color, BIPOC students would speak up about it, the admin would still be like hesitant and be like, but I think the white students are not going to want this. Like they're going to feel uncomfortable with students of ethnic studies college. And then as soon as we started getting more white students coming to those meetings with faculty and staff members and then voicing like, hey, me as a white person, I also want to study of ethnic studies college because I can learn about other communities. I can learn from like a Black professor about Black like history. I can learn from Indigenous professor like Indigenous history and all that. So I think I think white folks do need to speak up that they want this ethnic studies college or this ethnic studies curriculum, because most of the time administrators or just folks that are, you know, deciding these things are going to think, well, it's only going to benefit a small part of the like population, right? And so I think what we need to make with ethnic studies is like, no, it benefits everyone. Everyone becomes more culturally competent. Everyone becomes more self-aware, more critical, more anti-racist. And so I think that's the biggest difference that I saw, is that people will understand why a BIPOC person will want to advocate for their like department or their College of Ethnic Studies. But I think a lot of times there's that fear that like white folks are going to resist it. And if white folks are more willing to show like, no, I'm actually super excited for this, then I think that gets the ball rolling a little bit more. You know, just the old saying of like really more numbers, the better, right?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Samara, with that being said, I'm Deb Richardson. I teach in Lewis County, and I would like to implement this into my curriculum, but I do worry about the feedback because of the community that I live in. I live in Lewis County, and I'm on the I-5 corridor where that controversial sign was. I don't know if you saw it in the news that there's this sign with the picture of Uncle Sam, and they say really horrible things on there. And like one of the horrible things was it said that there's not going to be a Mexican Olympic team because they had swam over here. And that's plastered on this board. And then the sheriff came out from Lewis County and he said that we shouldn't become sheep when wearing our mask. So I live in this community, and the sheriff, I think it was a sheriff, he said that, and I know some of my parents were in that audience who I teach the kids. So I just worry, how do I implement something like this without losing my job?
No, that's definitely really hard. And I don't think I've been in that extreme of context, like conservative wise. But I would say, again, kind of similar, like finding those folks and allies that you do trust within your community. And then I think also it can be smaller steps, right? Like I know someone just put in a question about children's books or short film clips. So maybe you can't do the whole systematic change that some people can, but maybe you can just implement the types of books that you send home, especially, you know, maybe in your context, you will have to focus just on the BIPOC students, like be like, what does this, like these 2 or 3 Black students in my class need? Okay, I will send them specifically home with this extra book, this extra film that shows them in the picture, you know? Or like with my Latinx students, I will just have to like make sure I send them with Spanish translated things for their homework or something. So I think maybe in your context, it will have to be smaller scale and just focusing on those students that need that, or those families that need that support within your community, because it sounds like y'all are already such few BIPOC within that. And then instead of trying to make a whole change in the town until maybe other white people join you and start making that change, you know, because it definitely, we don't want to put you at risk. And also it's going to be, again, burnout. Like you're going to burn out if you're just trying to make a whole change in that town. So I think maybe, yeah, just focusing smaller scale within your context. And I think, again, everyone should remind themselves that like it is going to be contextual. Like what I was doing at Western I was able to happen because someone else had already started that work, but maybe someone in like Eastern Washington wouldn't be able to push for ethnic studies college, right? And so I think, again, just think about your context and what small actions can you do that I'm sure will eventually build and impact those students that you do reach out to, or those families. And then maybe by the time they get to college, they'll be like, okay, now I know about ethnic studies because, you know, Miss Richardson told me about this. So I think just making those small seeds is a big win already.
Right. I found a curriculum called Teaching Tolerance, and it's free. And so because I teach leadership, I have shown videos from that. And I always kind of tiptoe around it because they are entering 6th graders and I am the entrance to middle school. So I want to start setting the tone that you need to be respectful of all. So when I show that video, I get a little nervous. I've even done, it's called the Children's March. and that's a real good one. And then I've shown another one about the diary of the girls, how they had to walk because of, you know, Hitler and stuff like that. So I do introduce it, and I do worry. I mean, I haven't lost my job yet, but I'm still trying. Baby steps.
Yeah, and I think that in a lot of this work, sometimes I get discouraged. I'm like, oh, I'm not out there protesting every day or doing these big moves or really putting myself at risk. But this work that I'm doing today, right? Like, this is part of that movement. And so I think, like, it's honestly a capitalist like notion of thinking that like small actions, individual actions can't make a big impact. And like, that's not, like, we gotta reframe our thinking of that too. Like, relationship building is like an act of resistance. Like, relationship building is activism. And so if all you're doing is building relationships with your students that are students of color, I would say that's already a big win. I would recommend the book Emergent Strategy. I'll type it into the thing, but she talks a lot about that, like how relationships are activism and it doesn't have to be this big action.
So Samara, there was some discussion about teaching the curriculum since time immemorial, which is a Washington state requirement, and how it's often overlooked. And so Jackie from Camacho Middle School was talking about incorporating that in a real deliberate way into their ELA unit. So if any teachers are interested, you can check the chat and see or speak directly with Jackie on how she did that. Laura Craig is a teacher at Timberline High School, and she was wondering if you or anyone knows about some attempts to incorporate these into the state standards, so the next generation science standards.
I have not heard of like a more state incorporation. Again, I've seen very much individual environmental programs do sort of this work. And so I think what I've seen mostly is that people will push for ethnic studies in a general education history aspect, but they kind of forget about environmental like education, because I think there's still this belief that environmentalism is like non-political. We're just talking about land, water. And it's like, well, no, it is political because there's like human aspect to it, right? So I think this is the work that we need to do, right? As environmental educators, is like, okay, how are we like, I think especially pushing those folks that are very STEM heavy to think like, hey, your work is political, it matters to a lot of Black and brown people. So how are you implementing this intersection? So I haven't heard of any sort of more like national or state incorporations, but I think that's kind of the work where we're at right now. We're like, we got to get folks that are not seeing this connection yet, like get on that.
Great. Charlie, do you want to unmute and just give a little teaser for your presentation in case anybody else can't make it to your session?
Yeah. Hi, thank you so much, Samara, for your presentation, and I really look forward to listening to your podcast and learning more of what you have to share and all the hard work that you put into this. I know it is exhausting when you talk about burnout. I really hear you and just want to raise my hands to you for the work that you do. 10 Gather and Grow. If you don't end up in room 2, come check us out. I put the link in the chat there. We have free resources. I think it's been years in this group that people have been like, okay, Charlie, what do you have? What can you share with me? And we actually have our website up and running as of like last night. We even have the like new and shiny teacher guide is like updated. It's not the old one. And I'll be sharing more about it in room 2. But if you don't end up in that room, really please check it out. There's a ton of stuff you can do and send your kids out to do or do on Zoom in the kitchen together, but it is culturally grounded and based, you know, connecting youth with the land. And, you know, it's made for, it's dedicated to educating people about wild plants, local landscapes, rich cultural traditions. So come check it out. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm so excited to check that out. I love how like receptive like small children are to these ideas too. Like it's just like I have 2 small cousins, like 5 and 7, and whenever we do outdoor stuff, I feel like they just are like, yeah, that makes sense to me that you just told me this is what this is called or this is the history of that. And it's just great to like really implement that when they're really young.
Lots of big fans of the 10 Gather Grow curriculum here. It's very good. Michael, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. I'm just wondering if you knew of any federal state or local agencies that are environmental or recreation focused that actually have started any campaigns to reach out to underserved communities?
It's been interesting with that. I feel like I've seen more like individual folks creating like GoFundMe, nonprofits, that kind of thing. Because like, for example, I just saw one that is taking off that these people got together and they're giving out camping kits for BIPOC, like includes like a tent and like sleeping bags and that kind of thing, in the Pacific Northwest area. And so they have a GoFundMe for that. So maybe I'll share that in the chat. In terms of like more official organizations, I'm part of more like smaller groups. Like there's an Environmental Professionals of Color Facebook group that I'm part of that people like share information and things like that. But I can't really think of any agency or campaigns. It's just been kind of funny because I feel like now I've seen like Sierra Club, like REI kind of be like, oh, look at us talk about diversity. And I'm just like, this is very just like within 2020 because protests have been happening and people have been holding you all more accountable. So I feel like it's been very small, like now I'm seeing everyone want to talk about diversity, but not really address like their history within their organizations. So I unfortunately haven't seen too many that are trying to reach out. I think I'm always skeptical, to be honest. I'm always like, is this performative? Were you reaching out or do you want to create change? So I don't know. Yeah, I haven't really seen any organizations that I'm like, okay, you're actually like implementing. I think it's more individuals, like how Charlie just shared, you know, like what they're doing. And so I feel like that's what I've been seeing more of.
We have a few more minutes, so if you have any questions that you're kind of thinking about or comments, you can go ahead and add them in the chat. One thing I'm seeing, Jennifer Knight posted a link to a Since Time Immemorial training webinar that's coming up next week. So if anybody is interested and have never looked at their resources, and they have a lot of really, like Hattie says, some really cool resources and things you can use with distance learning. And so definitely check them out.
I found the book that I was talking about, Emergent Strategy, and it's by Adrienne Marie Brown. I'll put it in the group chat. But yeah, just like her first chapter was so beautiful, talking about how relationships are activism and we can look into the smaller scale to build bigger. So I'll put that in the group chat because I think it's a good book in terms of just activism in general.
And I guess if you have any suggestions too for other podcasts or social media accounts or things that you know of that there's some, you know, that's really inspiring and something that maybe teachers would be interested in, love to know that.
Yeah, would it be okay if I include that when I send you like the slides? So that way I'll take like a little bit of time to put together maybe some resources. And then I was gonna, I think there was something else I was gonna mention as well. I saw earlier a question about like videos or books for children. One of the podcast episodes actually that I did with my friend Craig, who's this Black educator and environmentalist, he really likes the show Craig of the Creek, which is like a cartoon on like Cartoon Network, I think. And it's just a Black boy doing like outdoor things with his like friends, and it's like it's a cartoon, but I think it has one of those like very educational perspectives. So it's just Craig of the Creek. It's on Cartoon Network. I think he said it was like on Netflix for a while or Hulu or something. So again, if you're just like at home with your kids or you want to recommend a cartoon show, like Craig of the Creek is a cute one that they do outdoor stuff, and it's a Black boy, a Black family. So it's a lot of intergenerational work as well within that. Yeah, so there's the episode. Someone just put it in. Thank you.
Any words on how to address or talk about Aldo Leopold?
I feel like with him, I just got so tired of reading about his work throughout college. I was like, is there anyone else? I think a lot of times with folks like him, like, you know, I think his ethics about environmentalism are like pretty and they're good. But I think my biggest thing with all of these men is that like a lot of that is just so appropriated from Indigenous knowledge. And again, there's like no sort of recognition of like, we literally took off Indigenous people off this land to create national parks, to create state parks, to create anything that has to do with recreation. So I think with Leopold, like maybe he like doesn't say anything inherently problematic in his like writing, but it's just like him talking about spirituality and like having an ethics about the land. I'm like, Indigenous people had this and y'all just removed them and didn't acknowledge that and didn't bring that knowledge. So that's my thoughts on Leopold. I just got tired of being the only person that they would bring up in like environmental literature. Another book I'm sure maybe some of y'all already read is Braiding Sweetgrass. Like I wish that had actually been part of my curriculum. I had to find it on my own. But Braiding Sweetgrass is like amazing. So that's another good one that I recommend.
Stephanie, if I can just interject for a quick minute, Michael's question about federal, state, local, environmental or recreation agency campaigns that are reaching out to underserved communities. The No Child Left Inside grant is a fantastic opportunity. They've just released their newest call for proposals, which will be due in early November. It's given me an opportunity to increase our work with John and Pete at Wahilut Indian School and also with the Nisqually Youth Center. And it's strictly focused on recreation and getting underserved communities outdoors. It's fantastic. And if anyone else wants to work on our next round with us, let us know.
Yeah, and today, later today, I will be dropping an episode with a friend who does similar work, but in San Antonio. She has this nonprofit where she helps out youth, or she takes youth outdoors that have like incarcerated parents, or their parents have gone through the incarceration system. So it's primarily Black and brown youth in San Antonio. And they just go outdoors. And so she talked about abolition and the outdoors and that connection. So if you want to check that episode out later today when I drop it, but she's someone doing that work as well. So I think it's more like nonprofits that are really doing that work right now. Yes, I also encourage the Braiding Sweetgrass book club. I'm just looking at the group chat.
Like we have some takers maybe on that one. This has been amazing. I mean, we all just so appreciate you being here and sharing this with us. You're going to send us slides and some recommendations and whatever other resources you have, we're happy to share. And then we're recording this, so we're going to share this with our larger teacher networks as well. And I should mention that Samara's other hat that she wears is a digital media coordinator for the Thurston Climate Action Team. So you may see her name around town on those types of events. So look for her there. Can we just give her a digital round of applause, maybe? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was so great. I am a total nerd for education and the education system, so it's really cool to share a space with teachers and just think about curriculum. So I'm really excited for all the amazing work that I'm sure y'all will be part of.
Thank you, Samara.
Oh, and then I didn't really share my contact information. I don't know if it's already like on there, but it was like my last slide.
Okay.
Maybe I'll just share it and I'll let you all take a picture real quick before I log off or write it down.
And we're happy to share that in our follow-up email as well.
Yeah, I love like creating curriculum. So if like, yeah, that wants to be a conversation later on for your classroom, definitely open to that as well.
Fabulous.